Germany, March 2nd, 1944. 11:47 a.m. Lieutenant Robert Johnson squints through the gun sight of his P-47 Thunderbolt as a German Focke-Wulf 190 streaks across his field of vision at 400 miles per hour. His finger hovers over the trigger. Every instinct in his body screams at him to aim directly at the enemy fighter, to put that black cross dead center in his reticle and fire. But he doesn't. Instead, Johnson does something that feels completely wrong. He swings his nose ahead of the enemy plane, way ahead, aiming at empty sky where the German fighter isn't. The air tastes like cold metal and engine oil. His hands are steady on the stick. Through his canopy he can see the Focke-Wulf pilot's head, turned, unaware of the death bearing down on him. Johnson fires. Tracers arc through the frigid air like angry hornets, curving in a beautiful, deadly parabola. For a split second, nothing happens. The Focke-Wulf continues its turn, seemingly untouched, and Johnson's heart sinks. Did he miss? Then the German fighter flies directly into his stream of bullets. Metal tears. Smoke erupts. The Focke-Wulf's canopy shatters, and the aircraft tumbles from the sky, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud. Johnson's 27th kill. His hands are shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system. He just shot down an enemy plane by aiming at a spot where it wasn't. And he's about to help change aerial warfare forever. Let's rewind to 1942. American fighter pilots are entering combat over North Africa and Europe, and they're getting slaughtered. The numbers are brutal. In early engagements against the Luftwaffe, American pilots are being shot down at rates that make commanders physically sick. The kill-to-loss ratio is embarrassing, sometimes approaching 1-to-1, meaning for every German plane destroyed, an American plane goes down. The British have been fighting for 3 years. The Germans have been honing their skills since Spain in 1936. And the Americans? Most of them learned to fly on crop dusters in Oklahoma, or training aircraft that barely broke 200 miles per hour. Captain Don Gentile, who would later become one of America's top aces, remembers his first combat mission over France. I lined up behind a Messerschmitt, got him perfectly in my sights and opened fire. I watched my tracers pass harmlessly behind his tail. Then he barrel rolled and suddenly he was behind me. I nearly died in my first 30 seconds of combat. The problem isn't courage. American pilots have that in abundance. The problem is physics. When you're traveling at 400 miles per hour and your target is traveling at 350 miles per hour, perpendicular to you, and you fire bullets that travel at 2,800 feet per second, those bullets don't go where you point them. They follow a curved trajectory. And by the time your bullets reach the spot where you aimed, your target has moved, sometimes by hundreds of feet. It's called deflection shooting. And in 1942, almost no American pilot understands how to do it. They're trained on ground targets and slow-moving towed sleeves. When they try to shoot at a target crossing their nose at combat speeds, they aim directly at it, and miss every single time. The human brain isn't wired for this kind of calculation. You see a target, your instinct is to point at it and shoot. That works fine for throwing a rock at a stationary object. It works okay for shooting at something moving directly toward or away from you. But for hitting something crossing perpendicular to your flight path, you might as well be trying to hit a hummingbird with a dart while riding a motorcycle. Colonel Cass Houff, stationed at Wright Field in Ohio, is staring at after-action reports in his office, and the pattern is undeniable. American pilots are expending thousands of rounds for every confirmed kill. Film from gun cameras shows tracer rounds consistently passing behind enemy aircraft. Pilots are reporting frustration, confusion, and fear. Something has to change fast. To understand the solution, we need to understand the problem. And the problem is that dogfighting exists in a three-dimensional space where everything you learned about shooting becomes obsolete. Imagine you're standing on the side of a highway and you want to throw a baseball through the window of a car traveling at 60 miles per hour. Your instinct is to throw it directly at the car. But by the time the baseball reaches the car's position, the car has moved forward. You miss behind it. Now imagine that instead of standing still, you're also driving at 60 miles per hour on a perpendicular road. And instead of a baseball, you're throwing something that travels much faster, but still takes time to reach the target. And the car you're aiming at isn't traveling in a straight line. It's turning, climbing, diving, and the driver is actively trying to avoid getting hit. That's deflection shooting. The mathematics are brutal. When a fighter crosses perpendicular to your flight path at 350 miles per hour, and you're traveling at 400 miles per hour, and your bullets take approximately 1 second to travel 2,800 feet, you need to aim roughly 500 feet ahead of the target, about 5 plane lengths, just to have your bullets and the target arrive at the same point in space at the same time. 5 plane lengths of empty air. Your brain sees the enemy fighter. Your brain wants you to aim at the enemy fighter. But if you do, you'll miss every time. The British had figured this out earlier in the war through sheer bloody experience. Their veteran pilots developed an intuitive feel for deflection shooting. They called it leading the target, like a hunter leading a flying duck. But it was an art, not a science. Some pilots could do it naturally. Most couldn't. And the British weren't exactly eager to share their hard-won tactical knowledge with their American cousins, who they viewed as inexperienced and overconfident. The Germans, meanwhile, had developed training programs that emphasized deflection shooting from day one. Luftwaffe pilots practiced on elaborate ground rigs that simulated crossing targets. They used a technique called ring and bead sighting, where they would place the enemy aircraft at a specific point on their gun sight ring, based on the angle and speed differential. American pilots had none of this. They learned to shoot at towed targets that flew straight and level. They practiced formation flying. They learned aerobatics. But deflection shooting, that was something you figured out in combat, if you survived long enough. By mid-1943, the US Army Air Forces realized they had a crisis on their hands. Wright Field, Ohio, September 1943. This is where the revolution begins. Not in the sky, but in a laboratory. A team of mathematicians, physicists and engineers has been assembled under the direction of Colonel Cass Hof. Their mission? Turn deflection shooting from an intuitive art into a teachable science. Among them is a brilliant young mathematician named John Craigie, who has been studying ballistics and three-dimensional geometry. Craigie approaches the problem like a physicist. He breaks down every variable: bullet velocity, aircraft speed, crossing angle, range, bullet drop due to gravity, wind resistance, convergence patterns of wing-mounted guns. He fills blackboards with equations that look like alien hieroglyphics to the pilots who occasionally wander through the lab. But Craigie has a gift. He can translate complex mathematics into simple visual concepts. He develops something called the lead computing gun sight. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. The real breakthrough is pedagogical. Craigie and his team create a training program that teaches pilots to see deflection, shooting not as magic, but as predictable geometry. The key insight is this: don't think about where the enemy is. Think about where the enemy will be when your bullets arrive. They build specialized training devices, mechanical simulators that allow pilots to practice deflection shooting on the ground over and over until the muscle memory becomes automatic. They create visual aids showing the exact amount of lead required at different angles and speeds. They film successful deflection shots and break them down frame by frame. Most importantly, they develop a simple rule of thumb that any pilot can remember in the heat of combat. Lead by the wingspan of the target times the angle off. If the enemy is crossing at a 90-degree angle, perpendicular, lead by approximately 3 wingspans. At 45 degrees, lead by about 1.5 wingspans. At 30 degrees, less than 1 wingspan. The exact numbers vary based on range and speed, but this simple formula gives pilots a starting point, a way to overcome their instincts. By December 1943, the new training program is ready for field testing. The location? Pinellas Army Airfield, Florida. The guinea pigs. A group of replacement pilots about to ship out to the European theatre. Lieutenant James Howard is 23 years old, fresh out of flight school and convinced he's going to die over Europe. He's heard the stories from returning pilots about how the Germans seem to shoot with supernatural accuracy, while American bullets pass harmlessly through empty air. Then he arrives at Pinellas, and everything changes. The instructor, a captain with a distinguished flying cross, gathered us in a classroom. Howard would later write in his memoir. He said 3 words that would save my life. Aim behind nothing. The training is unlike anything the pilots have experienced. Instead of the old method, shooting at a towed sleeve that flew straight and level, they practice on targets that maneuver. They use specially modified AT-6 Texan trainers equipped with gun cameras. They fly against each other, over and over, filming their shooting attempts, and then reviewing the footage to see where their bullets actually went. The first day is humbling. Howard makes 10 firing passes at a target crossing perpendicular to him. He misses all 10. The gun camera footage shows his bullets passing consistently 6 to 8 plane lengths behind the target, exactly what his instincts told him to do. I couldn't believe it, Howard remembers. I had the target perfectly centered in my gun sight, perfect shot, and I missed by half a football field. But then comes the adjustment. The instructors show him the mathematics, the geometry. They put him in a ground simulator, basically a rotating chair with a mock gun sight, and have him practice leading the target. They drill the formula into his head, wingspan times, angle off. By day 3, Howard starts connecting. By day 5, he's hitting on 40% of his passes, a rate that would have made him an ace in the early days of the war. By the time he leaves Pinellas, 2 weeks later, he understands deflection shooting at a visceral level. It's no longer theoretical, it's muscle memory. Across the training pipeline, the same transformation is happening. New pilots are arriving in Europe with a skill set that would have seemed like witchcraft a year earlier. But here's the really revolutionary part. The training doesn't stop at deflection shooting fundamentals. The instructors teach tactics specifically designed to leverage this new capability. They teach pilots to force deflection shots by maneuvering into crossing positions. The old tactic was to get directly behind an enemy aircraft, a 6 o'clock position, and shoot. That's actually the worst position for deflection shooting, because the target isn't crossing your flight path. It's flying directly away from you. If the enemy aircraft turns even slightly, you have almost no lead time to adjust. The new tactic, approach from an angle, force the enemy into a crossing turn and nail them with a deflection shot as they pass through your field of fire. It's faster, deadlier, and harder to defend against. By early 1944, American fighter groups in Europe are equipped with something else that makes deflection shooting even more effective. The new K-14 gun sight. February 1944. RAF Debden, England. The P-51 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group are being retrofitted with a device that looks like something out of science fiction. It's called the K-14 gun sight, and it's about to make American pilots the most lethal aerial hunters in history. The K-14 is a gyroscopic-led computing gun sight, essentially an analog computer mounted in the cockpit. The pilot sets the wingspan of the target aircraft using a dial. Each German aircraft has a known wingspan. Then, when the pilot places the reticle on the target and begins tracking it, the gun sight automatically calculates the required lead based on the rate of turn. A ring of diamonds appears in the gun sight. These diamonds show where the bullets will actually go if the pilot fires. All the pilot has to do is maneuver until those diamonds overlap the target, then shoot. It sounds simple. It is simple, once you understand how to use it. But it requires a completely different mindset. Instead of aiming at the target, pilots aim with the computing diamonds. The gun sight does the deflection calculation automatically. Major George Preddy, who will end the war as one of America's top aces with 26.8 kills, describes his first experience with the K-14. It felt like cheating. I tracked a Messerschmitt through a turn, watched the diamonds walk right onto his fuselage, pressed the trigger, and he exploded. The whole engagement lasted maybe 3 seconds. With the old ring and bead sight, I would have needed twice as long, and probably would have missed. But here's the crucial part. The K-14 gun sight is useless without the deflection shooting training. You still need to understand lead angles, crossing speeds, and proper positioning. The gun sight does the fine calculations, but the pilot has to set up the shot correctly in the first place. Think of it like a calculator. It can do arithmetic faster than your brain, but you still need to know which calculation to perform. The pilots who went through the new deflection shooting training program understood the principles. The gun sight just made them faster and more accurate. The combination of training and technology creates a quantum leap in lethality. By March 1944, American fighter groups equipped with the K-14 and trained in deflection shooting are achieving kill ratios of 5-1, 8-1, even 10-1 against the Luftwaffe. That's not a modest improvement. That's a revolution. Let's talk about what happens when theory meets reality at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany. March through June 1944, the period historians call the Air Superiority Campaign. American P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs are escorting bomber raids deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe is throwing everything they have at them. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, even the new Mi-262 jets. The Germans are experienced, well-trained, and flying excellent aircraft. And they're being massacred. On March 6, 1944, the first large-scale bomber raid on Berlin, American fighters down 82 German aircraft, while losing only 11 of their own. That's a 7.5 to 1 kill ratio, numbers that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Captain Don Gentile, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, shoots down 3 Messerschmitts in a single mission. His gun camera footage is studied at training schools back in the States. Every kill is a deflection shot. In one sequence, Gentile approaches a Mi-109 in a slight climbing turn. He leads by approximately 2 wingspans, fires a 1-second burst, and the Messerschmitt's engine literally tears itself from the airframe. "I didn't even think about it," Gentile reports in his debriefing. "I saw him turning left. I pulled lead. The diamonds walked onto him. I fired. It was like the gun sight was doing the shooting, not me. That's the goal of the training. To make deflection shooting automatic, instinctive. To reprogram the brain's targeting system." By April, the statistics are stunning. The 357th Fighter Group, one of the units that received the earliest K-14 gun sights and most intensive deflection shooting training, achieves a kill ratio of 12 to 1 for the month. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, the Wolfpack, racks up 38 kills in a single mission over Berlin on May 8th, losing only 2 aircraft. The Luftwaffe notices German tactical reports from this period show increasing concern about American gunnery accuracy. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, interrogated after being shot down, describes American fighters as having impossible accuracy in crossing shots. He assumed they had some kind of secret weapon, and in a sense they did. But it wasn't a new gun or a new aircraft. It was knowledge, the knowledge of where to aim. Let's follow a few individual pilots through this transformation, because statistics alone don't capture the human dimension of this story. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who we met in the opening, is a perfect case study. Johnson arrives in England in 1943 with the 56th Fighter Group. In his first 3 months of combat, he scores only 2 kills, respectable but not exceptional. He's frustrated. He's expending hundreds of rounds per engagement and hitting nothing. Then he goes through the new deflection shooting training course during a rotation back to the States in late 1943. When Johnson returns to combat in January 1944, he's a different pilot. He stops trying to get directly behind enemy aircraft. Instead, he maneuvers to force crossing shots. He uses altitude and position to set up deflection opportunities. By May 1944, he has 27 confirmed kills, tied for the leading American ace in Europe at that point. "The difference was night and day," Johnson later wrote. "Before the training, I was trying to aim at German fighters. After the training, I was aiming at empty space and letting them fly into my bullets. It sounds crazy, but it worked." Or consider Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, another 56th Fighter Group pilot. Gabreski is already a skilled pilot when the deflection shooting revolution hits, but he struggled with gunnery. Then the K-14 gun sight arrives. On March 8th, 1944, Gabreski is escorting bombers near Berlin when he spots a formation of 12 Messerschmitt 109s climbing to attack the bombers. He positions his P-47 above and ahead of them, then dives through the formation in a high-speed, slashing attack. The gun camera footage from this mission becomes legendary. Gabreski sets up a perfect deflection shot on the lead Messerschmitt, leading by 3 wingspans. He fires a 2-second burst. The Messerschmitt's wing separates from the fuselage. Gabreski continues his dive, doesn't even look back, and sets up on a second target. Same technique. Same result. In less than 10 seconds, he's destroyed 2 enemy fighters in deflection shots that would have been nearly impossible a year earlier. By the end of the war, Gabreski has 28 kills. He credits the deflection shooting training and the K-14 gun sight with at least half of them. But perhaps the most dramatic example is Major George Preddy, who we mentioned earlier. Preddy becomes the top-scoring Mustang ace of World War II with 26.8 kills. The .8 is a shared kill. His preferred tactic is to approach enemy formations from an oblique angle, force them into defensive turns, and nail them with deflection shots as they cross his nose. On August 6th, 1944, Preddy shoots down 6 German fighters in a single mission, all deflection shots. The gun camera footage is studied obsessively by training instructors. What's remarkable is Preddy's economy of ammunition. Most pilots expend hundreds of rounds per kill. Preddy averages less than 100. His deflection shooting is so precise that he's essentially sniping aircraft out of the sky. "I aim where they're going to be, not where they are," Preddy explains to a reporter. "It's like throwing a pass in football. You don't throw to where the receiver is standing. You throw to where he'll be when the ball gets there." That simple analogy helps more pilots understand deflection shooting than 1,000 mathematical equations. Here's what the history books often miss. The deflection shooting revolution didn't just improve American gunnery accuracy. It fundamentally changed the entire tactical situation in the European air war. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots know that American fighters can hit them in deflection shots. This knowledge constrains their tactical options. They can't turn aggressively to avoid one American fighter without presenting a perfect deflection shot to another. They can't climb or dive predictably. Every maneuver becomes a risk. The psychological impact is enormous. German pilots become defensive, hesitant. They start avoiding combat when they can, trying to hit the bombers quickly and disengage before the escorts can react. But this defensive mindset creates a downward spiral. Less aggressive fighting means fewer successful attacks on bombers, which means the bombing campaign continues unabated, which means the German war industry continues to degrade. American tactical doctrine evolves to exploit this. Fighter groups start using fluid 4 formations, 2 pairs of fighters that can quickly separate to set up crossing attacks on enemy formations. It's called the Thatch Weave, invented by US Navy pilot John Thach, but it's perfected by Army Air Force pilots in Europe specifically to create deflection shooting opportunities. The tactic is elegant. When German fighters attack, the American fighters don't run or try to outturn them. Instead, they weave toward each other. Any German pilot pursuing one American fighter will pass directly in front of the other American fighter, presenting a perfect deflection shot. It's a trap, and by the time Luftwaffe pilots figure it out, they've lost dozens of aircraft to it. Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, describes it in a tactical report. We don't chase Germans anymore. We set up crossing shots and let them fly into our guns. The kill ratio has improved so dramatically that we're actually running out of targets. That last phrase is darkly humorous but accurate. By June 1944, German fighters are becoming scarce in the skies over Europe. They're still there. The Luftwaffe has aircraft, but they're avoiding combat, husbanding resources, trying to preserve strength. The aggressive, offensive mindset of the early war Luftwaffe is gone, beaten out of them by American fighters who can hit them from angles that shouldn't be possible. The deflection shooting revolution creates a cascading effect. Better gunnery leads to higher kill ratios, which leads to German caution, which leads to American air superiority, which enables the bomber offensive, which destroys German industry, which makes the Luftwaffe even weaker, which makes American gunnery even more dominant. It's a death spiral for the Germans, and it starts with American pilots learning to aim at empty sky. One question hangs over this story. Why didn't the Germans and Japanese develop their own deflection shooting revolution? The answer is complex, but it comes down to three factors: institutional inertia, different tactical philosophies, and resource constraints. The Luftwaffe actually had good deflection shooting training early in the war. Their veteran pilots from Spain and Poland were skilled at leading targets. But as the war progressed, and experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced, the training pipeline shortened. By 1944, new German pilots were arriving at frontline units with as little as 100 hours of total flight time. Barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone master deflection shooting. The Germans did attempt to implement computing gun sights similar to the K-14, but production problems and resource shortages meant only a small percentage of fighters ever received them. And without the training to use them effectively, the gun sights were just expensive paperweights. The Japanese faced even worse constraints. By mid-1944, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under American bombing and submarine warfare. They couldn't produce enough basic aircraft, let alone advanced gun sights. Their training pipeline, like Germany's, was producing pilots with minimal flight time who were expected to learn deflection, shooting through combat experience, which meant most of them died before they learned anything. There's also a philosophical element. German and Japanese tactics emphasized aggressive, close-in fighting. The idea of setting up long-range deflection shots seemed cowardly or unsporting to some old guard instructors. By the time they realized that sporting combat got you killed, it was too late to change the institutional culture. The Americans, coming late to the war, had the advantage of starting with a clean slate. They could adopt whatever tactics worked, regardless of tradition. And deflection shooting worked. How do we know deflection shooting training actually made a difference? Couldn't the improved kill ratios be attributed to better aircraft, more experience, or German decline? The Army Air Forces asked the same question, and they did something remarkable. They measured it. At Eglin Field in Florida, researchers set up a controlled experiment. They took two groups of pilots with similar experience levels. One group received the new deflection shooting training. The other group received traditional gunnery training. Then they tested both groups on the same standardized course, firing at maneuvering targets. The results were stark. Pilots with deflection shooting training hit 43% of their shots in crossing engagements. Pilots with traditional trainings hit 8%. That's more than a 5-fold improvement, and this was in controlled conditions, not combat. They also analysed gun camera footage from combat missions, measuring the distance between where pilots aimed and where their bullets actually went. Before deflection shooting training, the average missed distance was 8 to 12 airplane lengths behind the target. After training, the average missed distance dropped to less than 2 airplane lengths, and in many cases, the bullets were hitting dead center. The researchers also calculated ammunition expenditure per kill. In 1942 to 1943, American fighters expended an average of 2,000 to 3,000 rounds of ammunition per confirmed kill. By mid-1944, after deflection shooting training became widespread, that number dropped to 800 to 1,200 rounds per kill. That's not just more efficient. It means pilots can stay in combat longer before running out of ammunition. There's one more piece of evidence, and it's the most compelling. German and Japanese after-action reports. Enemy pilots consistently describe American gunnery accuracy improving dramatically in 1944. They attribute it to better training, better gun sights, or secret weapons. They're right about the first two and wrong about the third, but their testimony confirms that the change was real and observable from the receiving end. The deflection shooting revolution doesn't end with World War II. It becomes foundational to air combat training for every air force in the world. When the US Air Force is established as an independent service in 1947, deflection shooting is built into the curriculum from day one. Fighter pilots learn it before they learn formation flying. It's that fundamental. During the Korean War, American pilots face Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters flown by experienced communist pilots. The MiG-15 is faster and climbs better than the American F-86 Sabre. On paper, it's the superior aircraft, but American pilots achieve a 10-to-1 kill ratio against MiGs, and deflection shooting is a major reason why. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace in Korea with 16 kills, uses deflection shooting tactics almost exclusively. His gun camera footage could be used in a training film. Every engagement shows textbook lead angles and computed aiming points. McConnell never gets directly behind an enemy aircraft if he can help it. He maneuvers to force crossing shots exactly as he was taught. The training evolves. By the 1960s, the Air Force is using computer simulations to teach deflection shooting. By the 1980s, they're using advanced radar-guided missiles that automatically compute lead angles. By the 2000s, they're using helmet-mounted displays that project aiming information directly onto the pilot's visor. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. You don't aim at the target, you aim at where the target will be. This principle extends beyond air combat. Artillery crews use it to hit moving vehicles. Naval fire control systems use it to engage moving ships. Even infantry soldiers are taught to lead moving targets when firing at extended ranges. The deflection shooting revolution, born in a laboratory at Wright Field in 1943, becomes one of the foundational concepts of modern military targeting. It's taught in every service academy. It's embedded in every targeting computer. It's so fundamental that modern military personnel take it for granted. They don't even think about it consciously. But in 1942, it was revolutionary. and it saved thousands of American lives. Before we wrap up, we need to talk about the people who made this revolution possible. The instructors, engineers, and researchers who never fired a shot in combat but changed the course of the war. Colonel Cass Howe, who directed the deflection shooting research program, never received a major military decoration. He spent the entire war at Wright Field, far from the headlines. But his work trained thousands of pilots and directly contributed to American air superiority over both Europe and the Pacific. John Craigie, the mathematician who developed the training methodology, returned to civilian life after the war and became a professor at MIT. He rarely talked about his wartime work. Most of his students had no idea he'd helped revolutionize aerial warfare. The instructors at Pinellas, Eglin, and dozens of other training fields across the United States, many of them pilots who'd been rotated home after completing combat tours, spent long days under the hot sun, teaching deflection, shooting to class after class of eager young pilots. They didn't get distinguished flying crosses or headlines in newspapers. They got heat, exhaustion, and repetitive training schedules. But every pilot who survived a combat engagement because he knew how to lead a target owed his life to these forgotten heroes. Captain James Howard, who we met earlier, going through deflection shooting training at Pinellas, survives the war with 6 kills and returns home to become a crop duster pilot in Montana. In 1990, a researcher interviews him for an oral history project about World War II training programs. The 2 weeks I spent learning deflection shooting saved my life at least a dozen times, Howard says. I think about the instructor who taught me, a captain with a DFC and a limp from a crash landing in North Africa. I never got his name. I never thanked him. But I'm alive because of what he taught me. That unnamed captain represents hundreds of instructors who made the deflection shooting revolution possible. They deserve to be remembered. Let's return to where we started. Lieutenant Robert Johnson over the Rhineland in March 1944, aiming at empty sky and destroying an enemy fighter. Johnson survives the war with 27 confirmed kills. He returns to Oklahoma, raises a family, and lives until 1998. In his later years, he gives talks to aviation enthusiasts and military historians. Someone always asks the same question: what was the secret to your success as a fighter pilot? Johnson's answer never changes. I learned to shoot at where the enemy was going to be, not where he was. That simple lesson made all the difference. The deflection shooting revolution represents something profound about how humans adapt to technological warfare. Our instincts, honed over millennia of throwing spears and shooting arrows, become liabilities when combat happens at 400 miles per hour. Success requires us to override those instincts, to trust mathematics and physics over what our eyes are telling us. It's counterintuitive. It feels wrong. You're aiming at empty air, at nothing, at a point in space where your target isn't. Every fibre of your being screams that you should aim directly at the enemy. But if you do, you'll miss. Every time. The pilots who learned this lesson, who trained their brains to see the geometry, to calculate the lead, to trust the science, became the most effective aerial warriors in history. They achieved kill ratios that seem impossible, downing enemy aircraft at rates that transform the strategic situation in both Europe and the Pacific. By the end of World War II, American fighter pilots had destroyed over 15,000 enemy aircraft. The deflection shooting revolution didn't account for all of those kills. Courage, determination, and superior numbers played crucial roles too. But tactical analyses suggest that improved gunnery accuracy, driven by deflection shooting training and computing gun sights, increased American effectiveness by 300 to 500%. Think about that. The same pilots, flying the same aircraft, became 3 to 5 times more lethal simply by learning where to aim. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a P-51 Mustang with a K-14 gun sight mounted in the cockpit. Next to it is a display explaining deflection shooting, with diagrams showing lead angles and bullet trajectories. School groups walk past it every day, barely glancing at it. They don't realize they're looking at a weapon that changed the course of World War II. Not through raw power or advanced technology, but through knowledge. The knowledge of where to aim. The deflection shooting revolution teaches us something important. Sometimes, the key to solving an impossible problem isn't trying harder or fighting braver. It's thinking differently. It's being willing to do something that feels completely wrong because the mathematics tell you it's right. It's aiming at nothing and hitting everything. The next time you're facing a problem where your instincts are failing you, remember those American pilots over Germany and the Pacific, forcing themselves to aim at empty sky. Remember that sometimes the path to success requires you to ignore what feels natural and trust what's proven to work. And remember that innovations don't always look like better weapons or faster aircraft. Sometimes they look like a simple idea. Don't shoot at where the target is. Shoot at where it's going to be. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the deflection shooting revolution, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from military history. Next week, we're covering the story of how one mathematician's equation helped the Allies sink more German U-boats than any weapon system, by predicting where submarines would surface before the submarine captains themselves knew. Until then, remember, aim for where you're going, not where you are.